Hello, everybody. It's Saturday, the 11th of July, 2026. I'll probably put this out actually on the 12th of July. 2026 is turning into an interesting year in historical terms. Some people think of it as 1917, 1789, 1848, 1968, kind of big year where everything changes. And that's the theme of Keith Tear's That Was the Week newsletter this week. He asked what time it is, specifically in terms of AI, and he notes that the AI economy has multiple clocks, just like history, Keith, in a way. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think of it as 1905, Andrew.
What, because of the failed Russian Revolution or the Russian-Japanese War?
Actually, both. They both were precursors to what happened for about the next, 70 years.
Well, let's remind everyone, not everyone is as historically literate as you, Keith. What happened in 1905?
There was a revolution in Russia against the Tsar from St. Petersburg that was partially successful, but ultimately failed. It's when the word Menshevik and Bolshevik emerged out of that. And the Russian-Japanese War was kind of a background to that. And it basically set in motion all the variables that led to the Russian Revolution, but it also prefigured World War I. And that was the period just before it was obvious that the world was going to go through a transformation that resulted ultimately in American global leadership. But it took arguably 70 or so years for that to play out. Well, AI is at that very formative moment, I think, it looked at from a long.
So I take your point. I mean, we'll talk about these multiple clocks that you lay out in your editorial. But why 1905 when it comes to our current moment? Is it because we're expecting radical change and we're not getting it?
I think it's not visible yet. So in a way, I do actually think we are getting radical change, but it's only a small number of people are experiencing what's possible. It is not generalized through the economy yet. It isn't rolled out or deployed, as that clock says in the middle section. So I'm definitely experiencing it. I suspect you're experiencing it. This week, both OpenAI and Anthropic rolled out an upgraded version of Work. They call it Work, or Co-work in the case of Anthropic, which is all about making it useful to you in what you need to get done every day. And so it really is a very early stage of being fully formed.
Yeah, and it's interesting. One of the pieces you linked to this week in your newsletter is something from the Wall Street Journal I'm quoting the headline, "The Socialist Temptation of Sam Altman." So your 1905 analogy, metaphor is an interesting one. Is the AI economy, Keith, being tempted? The Wall Street Journal is always telling us about the socialist temptation of somebody or other, but it is our old friend Sam Altman, Slippery Sam, as I like to think of him, is he really being tempted by socialism, or is he tempting us with socialism?
I must admit, socialism is a word I've grown to hate, because in the American context,
as an old communist, that's quite a confession, Keith.
Well, I even hated it then. That's why I was a communist, not a socialist. But socialism really, in American context, and European listeners will maybe not appreciate this, simply means the capitalist state. It means that the state does more. And so this word socialist has lost all historical meaning and has become Americanized. And what Sam Altman is doing is suggesting that the state should own 5% of OpenAI. That's what's called the socialist temptation. Of course, it's not socialist at all. It's entirely capitalist.
Well, it's what Bernie Sanders and the left of the Democratic Party would describe themselves as democratic socialists.
They do.
So you can have your, I mean, some people would say you can't have your cake and eat it, but they say you can.
Yeah, look, clearly these words of, you're historically literate, Andrew. You must appreciate, as I do, that these words have a completely new meaning and have been ripped out of their original context. So democratic socialist simply means a capitalist politician that wants more state intervention in the economy. And that, of course, isn't socialist. Socialism was historically understood to be, and I quote, the first phase of communism.
Well, that's according to the communists. But anyway, I mean, we don't want to get, there was a debate for 50 years on the left about whether you could have socialism in a capitalist context or not. But this is a show, it was supposed to be a show, Keith, and I blame myself for this, for going down this road on tech rather than politics. So sorry, go on.
But just to come back to your question and make it more relevant, my answer more relevant. Look, the state gets more and more involved in life over time, generally speaking, because society's complex needs get bigger and bigger and bigger, and private enterprise simply proves unwilling or unable, especially in infrastructure, to pay for things where there's no clear profit. And what that leads to is the state just rationally taking over more and more things. Even the American state does that. And I do think that is endemic to capitalism. But what Altman's talking about is something a little bit different. And if you go beyond Altman to other people weighing in, it's very different. They're really talking about bypassing the state by having a sovereign wealth fund that holds equity in very successful companies, not companies nobody wants to fund, but actually companies everybody wants to fund. So it's very different. It's not.
So it's not. So I mean, to come back to this piece by the Journal, it's not really socialism, or it's a new kind of socialism. I mean, it depends how you define the word, but it's a new role for the state in terms of capitalism.
Not even the state, unless you call a sovereign wealth fund the state. I guess in some small way it is still the state, but a sovereign wealth fund typically acts independently and makes its own decisions separate from the government, based on pure economic self-interest, if you will. And so what it really is a kind of end game in capitalism, where private ownership of companies has reached the point of producing so much wealth that it's possible to imagine everybody benefiting from it. That's really never been the case in
it's the opposite of British Leyland. Remember that old British nationalized car company that every time anything in the UK after the war got nationalized, it became incredibly inefficient and worthless.
Yeah,
it's the reverse of that.
Yeah, nationalization historically has been either saving something that's dying and usually failing to do that, or taking over something that is considered monopolistic. But in America, that didn't really happen. It more split things up to make it more competitive.
Yeah, you had the whole antitrust stuff. Let's get into your multiple clocks, because it's an intriguing idea. You say the AI economy has multiple clocks, and you break it up into short, medium, and long term. So tell us what these clocks, what's saying on all these different clocks. Of course, in your visual of your editorial this week, the clock is at 10:09, but those 10:09s are very different kinds of times.
Yeah. So what I'm trying to do here is make logical sense out of a huge flood of AI related news and stories and developments. And I decided that just for my own thinking, I wanted to divide it firstly into micro issues and macro issues, big picture, small picture, or strategic and tactical, if you will. And then to put each of those on a short, medium, and long-term timeline. Once you do that, you can put pretty much every story in one of these rectangles. So at the micro level is what we all get obsessed with. So this week, OpenAI and Anthropic deployed new versions of both their models and their desktop applications. And the box says deployment friction. They're all trying to get, especially businesses, to adopt AI, to use it, and they're trying to provide tools that make that easier for them to do. And it's very tactical. They're hiring large numbers of engineers. Microsoft and Amazon both are spending several billion on what's called forward deployed engineers. And those forward deployed engineers are all about getting stuff adopted or deployed. That's the obsession of the moment in that bottom left-hand
corner. And one of the pieces of news that might have been a bit late for the newsletter is that Apple is suing AI for stealing its ideas, or at least supposedly stealing its ideas. So there's a legal component to your micro workflows, people experience.
Yeah. And that's very short term, meaning that's probably the obsession for the next 1 to 3 years. In the medium term there on the micro, we've got work adapts, which always takes longer because established practices have to be replaced or evolve towards new practices. But it's really about the human as the driver of AI, as opposed to AI being imposed on humans. And it's really about the acceptance of a tool broadly in the economy.
We hope, of course. I mean, there is another narrative of that.
Right. And then the long-term micro is really all about how it affects our non-work life.
This is your civilization. This is where I think you and I probably disagree. And I'm quoting you, the fourth clock is long-term civilization. I'm always a bit wary of that C word. And I'm quoting you, Navin Narayan, will come to his piece later, calls AI a normal technology. I like that phrase, and this is you. I like that phrase because it deflates hysteria without deflating importance. Electricity was a normal technology. The internet was a normal technology. Normal technologies do not change the world by magic. They enter institutions, change workflows, change new jobs, destroy old ones, and take longer than their loudest advocates expect. I agree with that. But what's the civilizational element?
Well, that goes back to the Altman piece. The civilization element is what kind of life can we afford for people? And what kind of life experience can they expect to have? And we're nowhere near answering that. If you look at the piece this week about the education piece about Brown, where the professor is aghast at the fact that the students are using AI.
Yeah, I missed that piece. But anyway, go on. Tell me about the piece. Who's it by?
I can't remember who wrote it, to be honest. We'll have to look and say the name. But it was in the higher education publication. And what happened is he gave them a take-home test, and they all got 90+%. And he accused them of using AI collectively, and he forced them to take a similar test.
I did see that, yeah. And then none of them did very well.
The average was in the 40s, and he called it cheating. And that's because he is scoring memory. His job, he believes, is to score memory, what you can remember from what you've read. It isn't really scoring understanding; it's scoring memory. And in response, I would say he is historically dated, although it doesn't appear that way. He appears to be in the right in the context we're in today.
Now back to 1905, and of course, these kids, for the privilege of maybe what you call learning memory, are paying $100,000 a year at Brown to enable this guy and people like him to maintain their lifestyles and ideologies.
Yeah. So, what life can we expect is an exciting question, to be honest, Andrew, because the answer should be a way better one. And as we know, we've been going through this a couple of decades now, where everyone says, well, the future life of an American child is not going to be as good as the parents. I think maybe now you can begin to see that it might be better than the parents. And that hasn't been true for a long time. So optimism becomes grounded.
You mean in the long term? Because we're currently not in a very optimistic moment. I mean, you and I, you're very optimistic. I'm cautiously optimistic.
Yeah, but that's the micro, and then of course there's a whole macro stuff. The biggest of which in the short term is that everybody is complaining about how expensive AI is becoming, especially Anthropic. So Anthropic, everyone's turned against Anthropic, which is weird.
Well, you were already against them, so they're all following you, Keith. I'm not against Anthropic. I mean, it's a week-to-week thing.
Yeah, well, it is week to week, but just to name one podcast that's very influential, the All In podcast, literally they've all come down in favor of these Chinese open source models. Why? Because Anthropic, you can't control the cost. And OpenAI this week, when they launched their 5.6 Sol model, their selling point was that it uses way less tokens and can get things done faster. Therefore, it's cheaper. Not only better, but cheaper. So everyone's focused on price.
Yeah, well, that All In podcast is also very pro-American. I wonder what their friends in the White House, David Sachs, etc. I wonder what they think of that. In terms of getting to the future, Keith, you have an interesting piece by Matt Iglesias, very influential blogger, writer, Substacker, who argues that to save capitalism, we need radical land use reform. That's not very digital. That's not very AI. What's he saying? Why is land use reform so essential in terms of reforming capitalism?
Well, land is highly regulated in the US. I mean, very regulated. And it's mostly privately owned. And so if collectively we want to do something with land, it's almost impossible through the regulations to get the right to do it, even if you're the government. Unlike, say, China, where they can just
right. And that was the whole point of the Abundance book, is that to build a proper high-speed train in California, it's almost impossible. It costs billions of dollars to build a few hundred yards, whereas in China, for that same amount of money, they've electrified the entire country because of land use. So that's the problem. You and I mean, I'm always a bit wary of this abundance thing, and I'm your definition of abundance, not the Klein Thompson one, because I don't think they're quite as optimistic as you. I've always used the example of land, and you've always poo-pooed that, saying, well, there's enough land, but there isn't enough land. And that's why, in political terms, for example, the immigration issue has become so sensitive and people are obsessed with keeping people out of their countries. It explains the rise of nationalism. I just disagree with you on the abundance of land. I mean, you're going to say, well, there's enough land if you share it around, and if you go around America, there's a lot of empty spaces, but no one wants to be in those empty spaces.
Well, I'll give you an example that I think you'll identify with, Andrew, which is London. London is one of the world's biggest cities. It's certainly quite crowded. What's happened over the last 30 years in London has changed the meaning of the word London to include areas, some of them as far away as 30 to 40 miles away from London. And what did they do? The first thing they did is they created a zone where cars couldn't come in without paying huge amounts of money. So they reduced the traffic. They built the Elizabeth line, which runs east to west in London, all the way to Reading, which is another city altogether on the east side, and all the way, almost all the way to Essex on the other side.
Well, into Essex on the other side, part of Stratford. So okay.
They built north-south railways. They've built fantastic inner London railways, and the bus system is magnificent once you get there, as is the underground. That infrastructure has turned the land in London into something like 50 times more land than used to be defined as London.
Yeah, but that's all very well. Maybe that's true, but it hasn't brought down real estate prices. London, in fact, most people complain increasingly about London, that there aren't any Londoners left. If you go to central London, the place you talk about where there are no cars, you're not allowed to drive, you barely hear English. I mean, I don't agree with that, and I certainly don't like the politics behind that, but it doesn't create an abundance. I mean, your whole argument, your whole ideology of abundance is price is somehow brought down to zero. And if anything, London now is more expensive than it's ever been.
Actually,
with or without the Elizabethan, with or without the Elizabeth line and car-free inner zone.
Look, I don't know what you mean by expensive. I mean,
well, it's certainly not free to buy a place in London or rent a place in London, whether you're in Reading or in Kensington.
Yeah, but the idea that because something isn't free is ridiculous. I mean, free is an end game. It's not meant to be a short-term objective, hence the need for this timeline. Free is a tendency. It's not an achievement that's already in the bag.
Well, I mean, but it doesn't even bring the price down.
Wait, you can buy a really nice house now on the Elizabeth line and get to central London in 20 or 30 minutes maximum for a couple of £100,000, which is it's similar to a house in Kansas.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have the data in front of us, but I would strongly disagree with that. You're saying that you can buy a house, a 4-bedroom house on the Elizabethan line for £200,000.
You said,
yeah, maybe let's address this next week. You show me the data. I find that impossible to believe.
I'll offer you some homes, Andrew, on the Elizabeth line.
Right. I'm going to go back and live in London if I can get a 4-bedroom place for £200,000.
By the way, you can get a 3-bedroom condo right in the middle of the city of London that would cost, I don't know, $5 million in San Francisco for about £1 million.
Yeah. Well, maybe you should become a real estate agent, Keith. I'm suspicious of that. Let's talk also about America. You have an interesting piece from Noah Smith. I know he's one of your favorite Substackers, on the American age being the human age, and there's an element of nostalgia about your pieces. You also have a link with Yascha Mounk's Persuasion, an interview he did with the great Bulgarian social political theorist Ivan Krastev, on why America has lost faith in itself. A week after July 4th, 250-year anniversary, Keith, what do these articles tell us about the decline or reappearance of America?
Well, the Yascha Mounk one is interesting because it goes to the core. Krastev is basically saying that American exceptionalism, the idea that America is special, has had a very short life, really dating from about 1850 or so up until maybe 1970, the Vietnam War, and the
1850. But that's a short life, maybe in world historical terms, but that's half of the whole history of the American Republic.
Right. And he's making the point that it's gone, that there's no longer any confidence in America having a special purpose. It's been replaced by a defensive preservation of America. I mean, even though MAGA is let's make America great again, the content is let's stop America declining. So it's very defensive, and so Trumpism is not really optimistic. It's reactive to decline. That's my words, not Krastev's. But he zooms in on it, and he's kind of putting his finger on the psychological idea of America and making the point that it's now been lost. So what is there left to believe in? And that in a way is the same point I made earlier about the idea that your children will be worse off than you are. Maybe there's a glint now where that won't be true.
Yeah, Smith comes to, I think Smith puts his finger on something that's weird about America, is that on the one hand, Americans can't build a functional passenger train network. We know that from Thompson and Klein's Abundance. But on the other hand, the American AI industry is upending the world. And then he goes on, our healthcare system costs twice as much as that of any other rich country and nations, but our houses are huge and luxurious. So there are two Americas. There's the America in radical decline and the America that's steaming ahead, especially of Europe. I mean, you have a piece on from Paul Krugman, another of your favorite Substackers, on this perennial theme of European versus US economic performance. So America's weird. It's not in self-evident decline, but people think it is.
Well, Smith makes the point quite well that, and obviously he's abstracting here, and he's probably talking about DC more than anything, but he makes the point that America's grown comfortable with stasis, and with the idea that local veto power overrides national projects. And so you end up with stasis and satisfaction with the way things are, as opposed to a vision, obviously the opposite of someone like Elon Musk, who lives in the future in his head and is totally unsatisfied with the way things are. And if you were to contrast Washington, D.C. with Elon Musk, you kind of get a sense of what old America used to be more like Elon Musk.
We're not going to have an Elon Musk argument today, but it was interesting. I will come on to our interview of the week from my Keen on America show, but one of the other people I interviewed this week, and I think you'd like this interview actually, is with the Swiss-based geostrategic thinker Mehran Ghoul. He has a new book out called The New Geography of Innovation, and he argues that the American share of the global innovation economy is held relatively stable at about 45%. But what's changed over the last 20 years is that China has replaced Europe. So yeah. America actually has stayed the same, but instead of now competing with Europe, it competes with China.
Yeah, look, there was always a brain drain of European scientists to America, going way back to the post-First World War era. You know, American science definitely wasn't very American. It was largely European, actually. So Europe's decline started a long time ago. China's rise, I think, you know, is really dated in the last 40 years, generally speaking. And Chinese science, Chinese universities are world-class, and Chinese scientists are world-class. They didn't used to be very innovative. I do think that's changed in the last 10 years.
Yeah, and that's this book, Mehran Ghoul's The New Geography of Innovation, notes that the Chinese innovation is self-evident and highly competitive in America, although it doesn't necessarily forecast that China's going to take over. So maybe that comes back to your 1905 idea that, but rather than Japan, China is the version of Japan right now in 2026.
Yeah.
So Americans should be, I mean, for all the pessimism, whatever Ivan Krastev says, whatever Noah Smith says about the American age, I mean, Americans should maintain a degree of optimism, shouldn't they, Keith?
Well, that's the Mark Andreessen view with Ben Horowitz. They've coined this phrase, American dynamism, and they've raised a very large cluster of funds to invest in industrial reinvention, if you will. Robotics and AI being a big part of that, of course. And you know, the problem is the math. The American GDP versus Chinese GDP, there's only really one direction. The Chinese curve is up. The American curve is also up. But
well, we got the American GDP on screen now, and it seems to be going up. I mean, maybe not radically.
Well, if you put the Chinese and the American together, you can see the difference, because the shape of the curves are completely in China's favor. And China's now really America's equal by living standard measures of GDP, not by absolute. So it's clearly the case that American growth is slowing, which doesn't mean America isn't still growing. It's just the rate.
Well, maybe that explains Sam Altman's socialist temptation. Another interesting piece you linked to this week is by another old friend of the show, one of the more influential figures in Silicon Valley in terms of his thinking, John Battelle, one of the co-inventors of Web 2.0. He asked whether we've lost the plot. And he talks about whether our lives have become, quote unquote, dematerialized. What is Battelle arguing this week?
You know, I hate to say this because I'm older than him, but he's basically adopted the old man's argument that digital devices and media are atomizing human beings to the point where they live in isolation from other human beings. And he's elevating human contact in his story.
And he quotes, it's interesting, he quotes a piece from Ian Bogost from Wired. He said, Bogost argues that technologies of convenience and efficiency have destroyed our connection to the physical world. And Bogost actually was on the show, and it's our interview of the week. He has a new book out. He's a great interview person. I mean, he's a wonderful person to interview. He has a new book out called The Small Stuff. And I'm not sure that John Patel has quite understood what Bogost is saying, because he's not denying the value of digital.
Tell me what he's saying, because I didn't listen to your interview yet.
Well, he's saying that we should enjoy the small things. I mean, the small stuff is the stuff that he talks about. And one of the things that he and I talked about was our love of the Apple Watch. I got a new Ultra 3 watch, and he says this is something that parents should enjoy giving their kids. So
yeah,
it's small things that he focuses on, and small things don't have to be analog.
Yeah, no, I identify with that a lot. I've recently, you probably can't tell, but I've recently sold all of my digital cameras and replaced them with more handheld, smaller versions that are really, really good because of development and innovation. And as part of that, I'm buying, things like, I've got Japanese cameras with Chinese lenses. Here's an example of a Chinese lens.
Oh, well, that's very blurry, Keith. I'm not sure what that says about Chinese lenses. Oh, that's better.
So this is that's a Fujifilm lens, but it's made in China, and I get an unreasonable amount of fun from being able to take a picture of the flowers in my garden.
Yeah, and that's the point that Bogost is saying, is that we should get a great deal of fun out of picturing. I mean, maybe not with small lenses, but picturing flowers or licking trees or enjoying our Apple Watches, and that's where we've lost the plot. But I'm not sure that, and I'm not convinced that Patel is the reactionary, the old reactionary that you say in terms of have we lost the plot.
No, I don't mean he's reactionary, but it is an old man's point of view. And look, I don't think we've lost the plot. I think it's part of abundance. That's the 1905 point again. What we've really got is creeping abundance. And these small things in our lives are evidence, because if you go back in history, no one had time for small things. What we've actually got.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. I like that. If we go back in history, no one had time for small things. Although, they didn't have any they didn't think consciously about small things. They just did them. Or they took them for granted.
Yeah.
And what Bogost says, and it's interesting, and it comes to another piece of yours, is that he's not just a nostalgic analog person, but he does says that digital is destroying some things like tickets. He's very much someone who thinks that we still need to enjoy the physical ticket, whether it's an airline ticket or a concert ticket. And this connects, I think, with another theme in this week's newsletter, which is about Eventbrite. So tell us about Eventbrite and how they survived the business apocalypse, and why the internet made real life more valuable than ever, and how we can actually save the physical ticket, Keith.
Yeah, well, Eventbrite's a really good example of how the internet enhanced human connection. Human connection meaning come to my house for a party, or let's do a World Cup watch party, and Eventbrite and similar companies really express the ability to reach out, organize, plan using the cloud and iPhones and Android phones to bring people together. And that's clearly true. I would say digital tickets do that as well. I mean, you know, when if I get a ticket to go and see David Byrne at the amphitheater at Stanford University.
That dates you, Keith.
Exactly. But
you're another old alter cucker, as the Jews would say, like your friend John Battelle.
Right. So, yeah. So the Eventbrite story is a great story of utility delivered digitally to bring people together.
Well, you asked this week what time it is. According to my Apple Watch, which I'm going to, of course, wave at the screen, it's time to end, Keith. I'm not sure.
Well, the one thing before we end is let's just acknowledge the post of the week, which is about David Potter.
Not David Byrne.
No, David Potter. You might not have noticed, Andrew, but
I did notice. It didn't seem particularly interesting or relevant, but it's interesting and relevant for you. I don't think for anybody else.
Well, you know, David Potter was very well known in the UK. He ended up being sitting on the board of governors of the Bank of England. He started life in South Africa and built the first handheld computer, Psion, and he passed away recently. So I want to acknowledge that.
Well, you're losing all your friends. Last week, who did you lose?
We all lost Owen Malik, and
Malik, and now this week David Potter. Who's going to be next week, Keith? Harry Kane?
Ooh, let's hope not. Well, actually, sadly, on that note, Andrew, I don't know if you noticed, but this morning, one of the South African team, Jaden Adams, 23 years old, was found dead in Cape Town.
Oh, dear. Well, we better stop, Keith, because otherwise there's going to be more people dying around us. We will certainly be back. I know this week was what time it is. Next week we'll be back at our regular time. Actually, we'll be slightly earlier, but we'll run the show on Saturday. As always, Keith, don't die on me. We need you next week. We will talk again in 7 days. Thank you so much.
Bye.